All right, so I have here with me today Branko Marcetic. He is a staff writer with Jacobin Magazine, fellow with In These Times, and most relevantly today, the author of Yesterday's Man, which is published by Verso Press and is about Joe Biden and his political background and why he's not the right person to face Donald Trump, which, if I understand correctly, is the main thesis of the book. Is that fair?
Yeah, I'd say so.
Okay. Well, could you give for our readers a summary of the book's argument, the research you did, and why it was published now?
Yeah, sure. I would also say, it's a completely inadvertent pun that we're doing this on the day after Super Tuesday, when Biden literally was yesterday's man. In terms of racking up wins and delegates. Uh, why did I write the book? Joe Biden was going to run for president. I think there's a lot of anxiety about who's going to get picked to go up against Trump. Which is one thing. I think people obviously should vote for the strongest candidate to do that. I think on the other hand, people are also there's such an overwhelming focus on just Trump and getting rid of him that there's this idea that you could install a dishwasher in the Oval Office, slap a sort of D on it, and that's fine. That's all you need. And of course, we are at a very critical point in history. Not just in terms of the massive global inequality. Of course, inequality in the U.S. is now, I think, surpassed that of the Gilded Age. But also, if you think about the climate crisis and the need to overhaul the global energy system, basically the entirety of the way that the world has organized itself for the past a few hundred years. Um, that is something that is going to require a large political fight, not just in the United States, but across the world. And of course, if you're going to vote for the most powerful person in the world, and the U.S., declining empire though it may be, is still the most powerful country in the world. Um, I think it's pretty important to keep that in mind. I mean, the case against Joe Biden, I think, was the other part of your question. Uh, I make two basic arguments in the book. I mean, part of it is I'm trying to figure out what led Joe Biden to adopt the politics that he has. But the other part of it is that I'm saying, well, look, we already ran through this experiment once. Hillary Clinton in 2016 was the safe establishment candidate, the kind of centrist moderate that you're meant to supposedly put up against a kind of extreme and buffoonish right-wing candidate that's meant to just automatically prevail. Of course, she didn't. Suddenly, the Democratic Party is on the road to repeating that experiment. There's that famous quote about insanity being doing the same thing again and again, expecting a different result. And my case is that Biden is basically Hillary Clinton with well, in many ways, with her weaknesses turned up to 11. I mean, it's not just, the Clintons sort of alienated African American voters partly because of her record on criminal justice and her rhetoric around that. But I mean, Biden doesn't just have rhetoric. Biden has well over a decade of pushing really extreme tough on crime measures, often more extreme than the Republicans that he was trying to outposture in these instances. The corruption issue, I mean, Biden doesn't have as much of an issue with corruption as Clinton did, I think, but he does have a problem with it. I mean, the Burisma thing with Hunter Biden is just the tip of the iceberg. His family has been cashing in on him for his entire career in really kind of gaudy ways. Beyond that, I mean, immigration, Biden, like many Democrats, really, one, voted to enable the powers that Trump and Obama have used to launch the kind of deportation state, as people put it. But he also was the architect of the foreign policy that accelerated the migrant crisis coming out of Central and South America. Um, we could go on about his neoliberal economic policies, the support for trade deals, the many attempts to cut Social Security in Medicare. I mean, I could go on and on. So Biden has every weakness that Clinton does that would make him vulnerable to Trump in the general election. That's before we even get into his difficulties cognitively in this particular race. But beyond that, I also argue that Biden is emblematic of this larger shift in the Democratic Party that really paved the way to Trump. All these things that they were doing to sort of compete with an ever more powerful and extreme right wing in the United States. NAFTA and welfare reform and so on and so forth. Slashing government spending, that kind of thing. All of that really paved the way for Trump to rise up, not just by sort of emboldening or increasing voter apathy, but also by giving Trump, who is not an orthodox Republican, a way to sort of run to the left of the Democrats, which he did in 2016, and may well pave the way for a future sort of right-wing, a far-right populist, similar to Trump, to run as well.
Mm. So this interview takes place the day after Super Tuesday, where we've seen a surprising amount of victories, particularly in states in the South, for Biden. And what was particularly interesting for me was that he seems to be doing very well amongst African American voters.
Mm.
Would it be fair to say that's quite paradoxical, given his record on criminal justice, and given that Americans of color have suffered disproportionately from these hyper-reactionary criminal justice policies?
Yeah, absolutely. It is. I actually have a piece coming out today for Jacobin about this, where I basically argue. I mean, this is one of these central paradoxes of his career, and again, it's one of these trends, one of these elements of his career that you could really transplant to the Democratic Party. That the Democratic Party for decades, even though African Americans have been its most loyal base of voters, they have the party has systematically pursued policies that are contrary to their interests, whether in criminal justice or through the attempts to cut social programs and entitlements like Social Security and Medicare. And I mean, I think the support, and you're right, Biden has won because of the support of African Americans, particularly and mostly older African Americans in the South. I think the polling in northern states is not quite so pro-Biden among black voters, but certainly in the South. I mean, there's several ironies to this. One is that Biden had in the 80s pushed for the Democrats to become more of a party of the South, but crucially, instead of trying to mobilize these voters that have turned out in large numbers for Biden in this primary contest, he was saying, no, the Democrats are focusing too much on African Americans and other minorities. We actually need to focus more on that kind of that Reagan voter, the middle class, suburbanite, conservative white voter. So it's interesting now that he's really being propped up by the very demographic of voters that he was once spending, days and weeks touring around the country, urging Democrats to ignore. We also have to remember that Biden was VP for a while. I think one of the things that has taken a lot of people by surprise about this election is I think it has mirrored the Republican primary of 2016 in many ways. And I think people were expecting it to go the same way, myself included. But I think we forget that the Democratic electorate is, after all, a little bit different to the Republican Party. The Republican Party has far less of a trust in institutions, far less of a trust in media, far less of a trust in its own political elites, which is what Trump really capitalized on. The Democratic voters do not. They still trust the media far more than Republicans and even independents. And I mean, similar to Fox, MSNBC is really leading the charge for Biden, or at the very least for anyone other than Sanders. And obviously, liberal Democratic voters tend to watch MSNBC in high numbers, but they also still respect their political elites. Obama. I mean, so many people went for Biden in South Carolina because of Jim Clyburn's endorsement. I think something like half of respondents in the exit poll said that. So yeah, on the one hand, it shouldn't make sense. Biden has done tremendous damage to African American communities and other communities of color with his career. But on the other hand, if you think of voters as pragmatic and not necessarily super ideological, particularly African American voters in the South, then I think it does start to make a little more sense.
Yeah. I'm going to just read a quick passage from the first chapter of your book, which I think might be of interest to our readers. To return the United States to any version of normality that won't just lead the country straight back to another Trump, the eventual Democratic nominee will have to do two things. One, they'll have to beat Donald Trump at the ballot box, thus removing him from the White House. And two, they'll need to midwife a fundamental break from the political status quo, removing or mending the conditions that led to his rise in the first place. This book makes the case that Joe Biden, beloved elder statesman and current frontrunner, will not do the second and may well fail at the first. So, what are your thoughts about Bernie Sanders and his campaign? Do you think that he represents a real alternative that breaks from the Democratic status quo?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Sanders' campaign in many ways is kind of the heir to the Rainbow Coalition that Jesse Jackson ran in '84 and in '88 again, which interestingly, by the way, Biden opposed. Biden was very clear about this. He said at one 1986 NAACP convention, he said, you can't put the Rainbow Coalition, this is a quote, you can't put the Rainbow Coalition, blacks, Hispanics, poor whites, gays against the middle class, which gives you an idea of what side he was taking and what his idea about the future of the Democratic Party was at that time. But Sanders is trying to forge, whether he succeed, open question, but he is trying to forge very much a new consensus, much more similar to the New Deal tradition that Roosevelt launched and that Biden was very briefly part of before taking a right turn very early on in his career. Sanders' theory is one that through a program of economic populism, the kind that really has fallen out of favor in politics, not just in the Democratic Party, but as a whole in the U.S. and really the rest of the world since the global neoliberal turn in the 1980s. His bet is that sort of message can knit together a broad coalition of voters, same as Jesse Jackson was saying, that you can bring, even though African Americans and women and LGBTQ people and a whole Latinos. All these groups have distinct interests that have to be taken care of and have to be focused on specifically. But if you target a campaign that is aimed at issues that cut across these different kind of racial or gender lines, religious lines, and something that's more universal, and what's more universal than the struggles that we all have, whether it's paying rent or paying buying groceries or being able to afford healthcare for us or our loved ones. If you can target that, you can knit together people and you can make them, whatever differences they may have, whether the cultural or otherwise, you can get them to unite around that. And it did work. I mean, that worked for Roosevelt and the Democrats for a while, from the 30s until about the 1970s. It was always a bit of historians call it the fragile juggernaut, the coalition of voters that Roosevelt put together. But it did work. And I think that's what Sanders is hoping to do. And I think that does probably represent the best case or the best path forward for getting us out of this rut and actually dealing with the just flurry of crises that are heading our way. Whether that will happen, we got to see the rest of this campaign, how it pans out.
Well, it seems to me that people talk of Biden as a centrist.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me that he's really more of a center-right figure, or at least he would be, say, in Europe.
Yeah.
And that the Democratic Party has, for the last several decades, been becoming a neoliberal party, essentially.
Hmm.
Have any thoughts about what the causal chain that led to that was?
Yeah, definitely. You know, as you say, I think a lot of these terms in the U.S. context, you know, are not always. They have a very particular meaning in the U.S. context and not really anywhere else. I mean, as you say, the political spectrum in the U.S. has shifted so far to the right that centrist Democrats, and really just ordinary run-of-the-mill Democrats are really better described as. I mean, they would be center right in any other country. I mean, the GOP would be way off the political spectrum the way it's gone over the last 20 or so years. Easily the most extreme right-wing party, mainstream major party in any developed country, at least a democracy, you know, in the world. But why this exactly happened? I mean, there's a couple things. Uh, in the 1930s, when Roosevelt launched the New Deal and really tried to reverse the huge concentration of wealth and inequality that had accrued over the past however many decades, there was a counter movement launched by it has to be said by some of the most powerful industrialists in the United States. Some of them planned a coup against Roosevelt that did not work out. Others gathered together. Interestingly, some of the main people involved in this were executives of DuPont, the chemical company that dominates the economy and politics in Delaware, which is of course where Joe Biden is from, and we can talk about that. But they launched a sort of a counter movement to combat the not just the political power of people who believed in a more sort of let's say liberal or even social democratic direction to move the country into, but also to combat the increasing popularity of those ideas and to make neoliberal ideas popular among the public again. And there's a great book called Invisible Hands by Kim Phelps Fine, who's a great historian, that really goes into this. A very accessible book. I'd recommend it to anyone. Um, that began in the 30s and continued through the 40s. You get a flurry of think tanks. You get journals being passed around. There was a journal, this is actually what I did my master's on, called The Freeman, that in the early 50s became kind of the collective, the collection point for scattered conservative writers. When I say conservative, I mean, in the US context, conservative. These are very right-wing people. And it held together this coalition of kind of libertarian and more traditionalist conservative people for a while, but then the traditionalists split. You get the National Review, and these are just two of many. There was Plain Talk, for example. There was this very, very virulently anti-communist magazine in the, I believe, the late 40s, and then it goes to magazines like Reason and now there's a whole massive network of right-wing media that's refunded by big business, industrialists, and that kind of thing. So I think that was part of it. I think we also have to look at the crisis of the 1970s. I say that one of the reasons that Biden took this turn is that in 1978 you have the Taxpayers' Rebellion, and so people are frustrated over the way that their paychecks are being eroded. First of all, by the inflation crises and the recessions that are going on through the 70s, which are sort of cast by people on the right as well. This is the reason why is because of social programs and there's too much spending on government programs. The fact that there's massive amounts of money being put into Vietnam and there's an oil shocks, the result of completely different set of circumstances goes unmentioned. But people start to see, they're having trouble buying groceries, filling up their cars with petrol. And at the same time, there's this narrative that all these unworthy other people, these minorities and the like shadowy figures, mooching off them. They're getting all these freebies while their paychecks are meaning less and less, and that leads to this taxpayer rebellion in 1978. California passes Proposition 13. That lights a fire under a whole bunch of other anti-tax measures all across the United States. And of course, coupled with that, you have, I mean, crime and drug use legitimately was rising in the 1960s, which is of course what Nixon built his victory on. And I think there's of course, this stuff is heavily racialized by conservatives in the United States, and it becomes this twofer where you have this rejection of taxes and social programs that are seemingly benefiting these other people, and you also have a reaction against the civil rights movement. I mean, we have to remember that racial attitudes were much more backwards than they are now. For all the rise of the far right, actually, the people are a lot more tolerant on the whole. If you look at the attitudes around, say, something like interracial marriage. So that already begins. That already starts it. I mean, Carter in 1976, when he's elected, Carter, we remember him now as this very nice, soft liberal. He was actually really the first neoliberal president. He started cutting spending and deregulating industries. And then in the 80s, you get something unspeakable happening, which is the equivalent of what we see now with Trump, for people in 1980, which is Ronald Reagan is elected, an actor who has crazy opinions about a whole host of things. Trees cause pollution, and he wants to go to war with the entire world, accuses people of being communists. Very extreme right-wing candidate. He's endorsed by the Klan, not once but twice, and he wins a landslide. And he not just wins a landslide, but he wins 2 landslides. And this is, I think, the thing that really solidifies it, is that Democrats look at this and they go, well, the reason we lost is because we're too liberal. There's this conservative turn in the electorate, and that's why Reagan won, and we have to move closer to where Reagan is to survive. That's the only way, and that becomes the modus operandi going forward for the rest of for the rest of time until now. I think it's also important to note that this coincided in the 80s with a push from the business world to really push the Democratic Party to the right. Things like the Democratic Leadership Council, the DCCC, and other initiatives. They were being funded by big corporations and lobbyists, and also by people like Robert Rubin, who wanted to push the Democrats to the right in a more finance-friendly direction, and then it succeeded. That's where we are now.
Mm. And it seems like that's quite tied up with the decline in unionization in the United States and the severance of ties between the labor movement and the Democratic Party. Would you say that's fair?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And we could go back into history and talk about the fierce labor battles that happened in the United States that really crushed worker uprisings and prevented a workers' party, an actual labor party from emerging. I mean, what I've told you is sort of one part of a much bigger story. But you're right. I mean, the decline of unionization has been really terrible. I mean, people forget how crucial unions were. The stuff in the 30s that happened in the New Deal, it didn't just happen just because. It just happened because somebody who was was in power, who was nice and wanted to give it to people. It also, I mean, that was it. Roosevelt did want to help people illegitimately, but there was a larger movement on the ground. There were lots of strikes, lot of labor agitation, and there was also a very strong socialist and even communist movement that ultimately was kind of snuffed out through the 50s. But these things were important, even if we can disagree with some of the things. For example, some of the American communists' kind of affection for the Soviet system and support of Stalin. We can say that those were bad things, but the activism was important to getting some of these things actually happening.
Sure. So many people in the United States don't know that Delaware is a sort of internal tax haven to the United States, and has long been, I believe, where the majority of LLCs are registered. Could you talk a little bit about Biden's role in creating this internal tax haven to the United States?
Well, this has a long history that really precedes Biden, but you're right. I mean, Delaware began. I mean, it started centuries ago, But it was really in those last decades, from about the 70s, 80s, 90s, that it really started to position itself as this kind of mecca for corporations to set themselves up in. And, you know, I mean, part of it was that it had very lenient bankruptcy courts that would favor the actual businesses that were going bankrupt instead of the creditors. Part of it also was that later on, you know, it sort of became this tax haven, and there were a whole series of other rules that made it easier for banks to sort of be in multiple industries at the same time. And Biden did vote for some of those things. He certainly protected it too. You know, there was an attempt to, it was called the Delaware Killer. There were several attempts in the 90s to roll back Delaware's special status as a place where corporations could go to get advantageous treatment. And Biden fiercely fought against that. And part of it is, of course, that, you know, he was getting donations from companies in the state, of course, that wanted to protect that. But also, you know, you can look at it as a classic case of a politician protecting a local industry and the jobs that came with it, because Delaware turned into this white collar, or at least Wilmington, downtown Wilmington, became this white collar mecca because of that. A lot of jobs in law and that kind of thing, to you know, deal with the many bankruptcy cases. And you know, I mean, Biden's relationship with MBNA, the credit card company, that's become well known. But of course, his biggest contributor, they hired his son as well. Biden also sold his house to an executive at MBNA for twice the price. So there's a close relationship there. MBNA pushed for other things. I believe they also pushed for the repeal of Glass-Steagall, and of course Biden voted for that. So I think that is really crucial to understanding. I mean, yeah, Biden's role in helping Delaware retain this status that it did. I think it's also important to note that a lot of Biden's turn on government spending and sort of the government's role in people's lives, it was a product of that conservative turn that happened from about 1978 onwards. But it also happened because he started taking money from big donors. And in 1972, when he first ran, he didn't. And he said afterwards, you know, well, you know, I had people come to my office and basically say, you know, are you serious about, you know, wanting to raise the capital gains tax? And he said, well, you know, if I wanted their money, I knew what I was supposed to say. He talked about how he didn't want to prostitute himself to donors, and how, you know, whenever anyone gives him money, it's a quid pro quo. There's always some strings attached. By 1978, he's opened up his fundraising to those very donors. And I mean, even before then, I mean, yeah, I think it's really important to understand the power that DuPont has in Delaware, not just the company, but the family members. I mean, there was a DuPont who was governor basically for all of Biden's very early career. And Biden, even though he criticized corporations in his first campaign, and criticized millionaires and billionaires and that kind of thing, he ended up really, he was soft in DuPont. He said, well, you know, DuPont's an example of a conscientious corporation that actually does pay its taxes properly. And very quickly after he won, he you know, a bunch of DuPont people came, you know, lawyers and the like. They came into his office. They became a staple of his office going forward, and actually even long-time legislative aides. And from there on, Biden we talked about how he would regularly meet with DuPont executives. And you know, there was a striving to have a good, comfortable relationship with the company, not to rock to me boats. So of course, you know, the company, well, you know, what they support, they're going to support lower taxes and lower government spending and a balanced budget and so on and so forth. So I think that helps to explain some of Biden's actions as well. You know, not to mention the bankruptcy bill, of course. I don't know if I mentioned that yet, but of course the infamous bankruptcy bill that he passed in 2005 finally, that was pushed by the credit card industry, including MBNA. So yeah, there's a lot there that I think informs Biden's choices over the years.
Okay, final question, if I may. the elephant in the room, I feel, is the Obama presidency. He, of course, was the vice president during the presidency of Barack Obama. Now, it seems at the moment that a lot of people in the mainstream media and commentariat are looking back at the Obama administration as if it was some kind of golden era, and as if Obama is some kind of wise old sage, whose words we should be heeding in this dark time. But the Canary in my work certainly has been arguing that Trump is really just more of a more extreme expression of something that's been going on for a long time in terms of war, imperialism, neoliberalism, and so on. Could you talk a little bit about why you think uh, Biden's association with the Obama administration is being presented by the mainstream media as some kind of positive thing?
Unfortunately, I think there's a tendency in liberal thinking that focuses on aesthetics and kind of very superficial things instead of actual substance. I think the Obama administration is one of those things. I mean, listen, I as a late teen, someone had just finished high school and was going to university, I supported Obama. I thought he was great. I was totally suckered in, I have to say. I think actually there are a lot of people in my generation who were. I know a lot of people on the left who felt a great deal of enthusiasm for Obama, only for that enthusiasm to be crushed by the reality of his actual administration. But not everyone took this critical view. I think a lot of people just, they saw, this wonderful symbolic thing of an African American man in the presidency. I think they saw the virulently racist and extreme campaign of obstruction to oppose him and to really destroy him, and they sort of closed ranks around him. Because the Fox News and the whole Republican right-wing media machine was so intent on demonizing him in the most over-the-top, cartoonish ways. And often not often, exclusively for things that were really ridiculous. That I think blunted any legitimate criticism, or even just the impulse to criticize Obama. And it has to be said that voters are very Democratic voters, at least, are very loyal to the party, becoming less so as less people identify as Democrats. But they're very loyal to the party, and you saw that with Obama's national security policies. I think the thing that won Obama that election was his foreign policy. He was against the Iraq War. He said he wanted to basically reverse some of the stuff that happened under Bush, the excesses of the war on terror and everything. And Obama, in fact, continued all of Bush's policies, and in fact, actually escalated them, certainly when it comes to drones and some of these civil attacks and civil liberties. And Democratic voters were okay with it because they said, well, look, I mean, we can trust this guy. He's not a maniac like Bush or what have you, so therefore he can be trusted to, be able to decide life and death, even for American citizens from the sky. And I think I think that's a part of it. I think right now, so much of the opposition to Trump is over aesthetics. He's boorish. He says offensive things. He eats his steaks well done or whatever. So much of it is these cultural aesthetic signifiers and not really the policies themselves. And people yearn for Obama because I think for a lot of people, they voted for Obama and they were like, okay, well, that's great. Now it's done. And we have a good person in the White House and he'll sort out. Because I think a lot of people have been taught that politics isn't about struggle. It's not about full participation every step of the way, not just in the ballot box, but outside of it. Politics is just seen as this thing that you do once every 4 years or maybe once every 2 years, I guess, for the midterms, and you vote and that's it. I think people are starting to wake up to the fact that that's not enough. But I'm not surprised that there is a nostalgia for this time that seemed normal, particularly for a lot of people who are maybe middle to upper middle class liberals, people who haven't necessarily felt the same kind of sting of the policies that Democrats have pursued over the past few decades. I think there are people who are waking up to it now, for sure, not just seeing the scorched earth campaign that Trump has launched in his presidency, but also, who saw Obamacare passed and, either struggling to pay bills or going bankrupt or just flat out not even able to get healthcare for basic things. So I think it is changing, but yeah, again, I think people just want to feel like things are normal again. And the media plays a role in that as well. But I won't. I think the silence is long enough. I don't want to keep droning on.
All right. No, this is a good place to end. Just very quickly, do you want to make a prediction about whether you think Biden will win now or Sanders?
I don't want to make a prediction because they're always wrong. What I will say is that we have no idea how things are going to change. There are innumerable variables. Biden's campaign was considered completely done approximately 4 or 5 days ago. In the space of 3 days, that completely changed. And it can happen again. We don't know how that's going. We don't know whether that's going to be due to Biden's performance, whether it might be due to an Elizabeth Warren endorsement, whether it's going to be due to some unforeseen event in history, which does happen and can change the calculus, and has happened before. We don't know. So I think that people shouldn't either be triumphalist, nor should they be pessimistic and apocalyptic. I think people should keep fighting for what they believe in, and hopefully they will prevail.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. That was very interesting and informative. That was Branko Marcetic. His book, again, is Yesterday's Man, published by Verso. It's available online, and I'm sure at many fine bookstores near you. All right. Thanks again, Branko. Take care.
Yeah, thanks for having me.